Hopefully, the gate is open. People are joining us right now. So, hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. And this is the latest in the series of webinars that we've been doing by the International Center for Journalists. And today we'll be looking at 2022 itself. Last week, when we started this version of the webinar, we started with the climate crisis, which is a true reflection of the vast nature of the subjects that we hope to be able to cover with this new mandate that we have, which is to expand beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. But how can we be able to be more effective as journalists covering crisis if we don't have better understanding of what the journalism landscape is going to be in the new year? And that is why we've decided to start this conversation today on what we expect will define journalism in 2022. And we are not just bringing this as a random conversation, but we will be leveraging on available data, existing reports, that are already giving us indications of what the industry is going to be looking like in the new year. And we have two experts to be able that will guide us in this conversation today. Let me start with a BBC veteran and who is now with the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Nic Newman. Nic, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
Pleasure. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick, for taking our time to be with us. Another panelist that is joining us today is Sam Guzik. Sam is a Foresight affiliate with the Future Today Institute. Sam, how are you doing?
Doing well. It's a cold day in New York, but it's fun to be inside here and talk with you all.
So thank you very much. So we are going to be having two presentations from our panelists who have done a lot on this subject based on existing data, backed with evidences, not just wishful thinking, so that we can be looking at what is the data telling us, so that we can better prepare for how 2022 is going to be in the journalism landscape. So we are going to start with Sam, and I think Sam, is your PowerPoint ready? Can we have that
Rock
presentation
on.
as soon as
Yeah,
possible? So
let's see how that
whilst
goes.
whilst Sam is projecting, if you have any pertinent question that would like us to address, please use the Q&A option on the Zoom if you're on the Zoom platform. And if you are watching this live stream of Facebook, please endeavor to use the comment box under the video that you are watching right now. I think Sam is ready, so Sam will take it from here.
Rock on. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where in the world you are. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to getting to have this conversation with you all. I want to quickly start with three things about me. My name is Sam Guzik, and so I'm a journalist by training. I started my career in the newsroom at Newsday, which is a local newspaper on Long Island. I'm a futurist, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. And I'm also a product thinker. And so I'm really interested in how we use this kind of insight about the future to build products that people are going to use today. And so it's really important to me that everything we're talking about as part of this conversation is really tangible and hits home to sort of how can we operationalize it today. And the key thing that I want to sort of hit home with our conversation today is that our goal is to have sort of analysis and research, not predictions. And so when I say that I'm a futurist, one of the things that I mean is that I look for signals that are sort of present in the world today that give us a sense for how the future might unfold. And so this isn't fortune telling, but it's really using the analysis and research that we can have and the critical thinking we can have about our world today to really refine our thinking about what's possible in the future. And so for that reason, I want to start our conversation with a very brief history of news. And it seems maybe strange or counterintuitive to start a conversation about the future with a conversation about the past. But I think it's important to do this because it's a good reminder that the history of journalism and the history of media has always been grounded in some kind of disruption, and that new technology has consistently been part of changing how news and information is distributed, but also what the business model is for distributing and monetizing that information. And so if you'll indulge me, I want to just sort of go on a quick tour, very, very briefly, of the history of journalism. And I want to start in Germany around 1440 with the invention of the printing press. Mechanized printing had been really around since like maybe the 4th century in China. It was across the Arab world in the 10th to 15th centuries. But in 1440, we had the invention of the mechanized printing press in Germany. And it radically reshapes the creation of printed media because information had been really expensive. It had taken a very long time to get places. And the printing press starts to compress that process and make it a little bit easier to move things. Jumping forward in time to the early 1830s, the printing press evolves and evolves and evolves. And fundamentally, in the 1830s, we see a new technology emerge, which is the steam press. And the steam press goes from the kind of manual presses that had been present since the 1440s and enables newspapers to create lots and lots of copies very, very quickly. And it created what was called the penny press because they could afford to sell the copies for just a penny. And it shifted the economic model of journalism from one focus on subscriptions or expensive single copy sales to something that was affordable to all. And journalism became something that everyone could reach. And it lets journalists move faster and reach a broader audience. Around that time, you also get the telegraph coming together. And this is the first time that information can travel faster than people. And so the business case for this was the development of the Associated Press. It lets you bring together information from lots of places. It lets you pool resources. And the value of this invention for journalism is sort of really visible and evident during the American Civil War, when it was correspondents from the Associated Press who were bringing that news across the world to different cities. And that was getting sort of syndicated into those local papers. Jumping forward a little bit further, we have radio transmission in the 1900s. This picture here is of WNYC's first day on the air in July 1924. And radio creates the possibility for new types of sponsorship and advertising. It's a much more intimate medium because it's coming directly into people's homes. And that leads you directly into the 1950s, where that business model that started with radio amps up. You get new types of storytelling, but you also get really sophisticated ways of measuring the reach of advertising. And we're still living through the implications of that today. So this is sort of really 4 or 5 generational shifts in how we've gotten information. And the reason that I want to start here is because it's a really useful reminder that we're not living through the first kind of disruption as an industry. This is a condition that has been with us for a very long time. So much so that when Edward R. Murrow was talking about it in the 1950s, he was able to talk about the way that it's really imperative to understand how changes in technology and business model come together to impact technology, or to impact journalism, excuse me. And when Edward R. Murrow said this in 1958, he was talking about TV, but it's just as true today. So put a little bit differently, the choices we're making today will determine whether the future of journalism is hopeful or bleak. But in order to do that in an informed and strategic way, we need to start looking outside our industry more, because having good strategy depends on looking at the forces that are outside our control and understanding how those are going to impact us. I know lots of us spend times thinking about how technology can help us optimize a subscription funnel. It can help us have a really efficient ad stack, but too often we don't look beyond what other media companies are doing with that technology. And so today I want to look at some trends and see how there's these trends that are adjacent to journalism are going to impact on us. And tracking these trends is just one tool that we have for building better and more resilient strategies to staff and fund our newsroom. And as we're thinking about this, as these questions and technologies that we're looking at are coming on the screen, I want to plant this question in your mind. I want to ask you all whether you assume the future will look like today, whether it's in your product roadmap, whether it's in the kind of reporting that you do, in the types of questions you're asking sources, whether it's in financial operating models. What are the implicit assumptions that you're making about the economy, about the way that technology will evolve, about how geopolitics will shape our world, about how the world in general might or might not change? It's hard to acknowledge that kind of uncertainty. It's hard to confront your biases in that way. But if you can do it, it's one way to really ask those essential questions that really push us to think about what the future might look like and what we're going to need to confront. Because newsrooms in the future are going to face new types of competition. And so in this talk, I want to push you to see what that competition might look like and what the evidence says about how the future might develop. Because the future isn't predestined. If we can identify a threat in the future, we can also turn it into an opportunity. But that's only true if we plan for it today. So let's get started. That's a quick way of sort of touring the world of foresight and why this is important. But to start our conversation, I want to look at this K-pop group called Eternity. It's one of the most popular K-pop groups in South Korea right now. They launched their first album earlier this year. And the reason I want to start here is because this group has no human members. Each of the singers you're looking at is an avatar who's synthesized by an algorithm. And because someone has a really great sense of humor, the debut single for this group called Eternity was called I'm Real. This is just one example of the emergence of something called synthetic media, which is an umbrella term for content that's generated by an algorithm. And this trend has real repercussions for all kinds of storytelling, whether it's video, audio, or text. Synthetic media is really going to change not just how media is created, but also it's going to be an enabling technology for other types of disruption across our industry. So when we talk about synthetic media, we often start here, which is talking about deepfakes. And if you haven't heard that term before, it's a catch-all for videos that are created with a specific type of artificial intelligence called a generative adversarial network. Deepfakes can be really scary. The most prominent examples of them are used for creating fake celebrity porn. They can be a vector for really serious misinformation. But when we only talk about deepfakes, we sort of miss something because we're missing the broader repercussions of this category. And we can see this in a few places. We can see on TikTok, there's a creator who's creating fake videos of Tom Cruise, spoofing Tom Cruise, doing really benign things. And some researchers looked around and did a test and found that most people can't detect that those deepfakes are fake, even when they're warned in advance. That's how good the technology is. You might have heard of a technology called GPT-3, which is an algorithm that can generate text independently. It can power chatbots, it can translate languages, and it can even write opinion pieces in major newspapers. And these examples, whether it's on TikTok, whether it's in The Guardian, are sort of a sign of this growing category of experiences that aren't real or fake, but are somewhere in between. So you may actually start reading this more and more. There's a slew of programs available online today that let you take advantage of these types of natural language models that can generate language. This one is called pseudowrite, and it's been used to help authors write many articles in newspapers. There's a book review in the New York Times that was written using this program just a few weeks ago. So you may already have read synthetic media without knowing it. And whether you know it or not, you may already have heard synthetic media. Some of you may even be using it in your newsrooms today. This is a tool called Descript, and it's used to produce some of the biggest podcasts around. It lets audio and video producers quickly manipulate sound. So for example, if a host misspeaks while recording a segment, or if a presenter is giving a webinar and fumbles on a word, you can just type a correction into Descript instead of recording the entire piece. And so if it's not obvious yet, synthetic media is going to dramatically lower the barriers to create content. It's going to make it easier to translate news between languages. It's going to power new types of aggregation. And it's going to open the door for personalized experiences at a scale that's really hard to fathom today. And this raises an important question. What new businesses will synthetic media create? Are you going to be living in a world where your favorite TV series might not end because an algorithm is going to keep synthesizing new episodes? Are you going to be experiencing algorithmic translations that lets publishers reach new audiences in completely different parts of the world that speak completely different languages? Will synthetic media let reporters create customized avatars to connect individually with subscribers? All of these are plausible futures. So there's lots of possibilities for opportunity here, but there's also new competition for us as news organizations. And so to put the question a little bit differently, is your newsroom ready to recognize these new technologies as opportunities? Or is it ready to seize these new technologies to find ways to reach audiences in different ways, to shape their expectations. And that may feel like an academic question, but there's real urgency there because consumers are already encountering synthetic media. That means that other creators and other industries are defining what expectations consumers will have for this kind of media. And there's a real risk to letting others define those expectations. We've seen this countless times in the history of media, especially in the last 20 years. It's especially true because we're not just seeing signs that this is affecting how media is created, but we're also seeing signs that technology is touching all parts of our value chain. So this is also changing search and how consumers find news. This is a research paper that was posted in July, and in it, the authors, some researchers from Google, lay out a vision for a new type of search engine, one that uses the power of AI to change how we think about discovering information. And in this paper, the writers imagine a future in which search engines stop just formatting the results as a list of links and instead deliver you a neat paragraph that just answers your question. This is a signal about what the future of search might look like. And it's a signal that it's also broadly, we're seeing broad changes. It's a reminder that we're seeing broad changes in how people look for, but also how people find the news. We're seeing signs more and more that people are gonna consume the news in a way that's mediated by voice, by AI assistance, and by this kind of natural language search. So as publishers, now is the time for us to start looking at these technologies and thinking about what they mean for us, not once we see the referral traffic from search starting to drop off. Many of you have probably seen this image. It's from a few months ago when Mark Zuckerberg met himself in the Metaverse. And so there's a lot of talk right now about this idea of a Metaverse, a different way of interacting with technology. And it's really easy to sort of laugh this off as a really cartoonish and comical thing. But it's not just Meta who's thinking about this. It's not just Mark Zuckerberg building an avatar of himself. There's a whole ecosystem of companies from NVIDIA to synesthesia and others who are investing in this and thinking about what this future might look like. And as these tech companies are building this today, the question is, what do we want to do about that? We can look around and see that there's a shift away from phones and towards other devices, towards wearables and smartwatches and headphones, soon things like smart glasses. These are changing the nature of computing. And so the question is, how do we want to respond to that? We can look and see that Amazon has already launched a pair of smart glasses probably 2 years ago at this point. This is a pair of glasses that has Alexa built in. So you can walk around with the Alexa assistant constantly giving you information. And these glasses don't have a visual component yet, but imagine the potential for storytellers or advertisers who want to deliver context to users without distracting them from the world. And that's something that the R&D team at Meta is thinking about when they're building a pair of glasses today and testing it in the real world that really tries to create a contextual layer of information to experience over the world. So for consumers, that means that they might be experiencing a world where instead of sitting at a desk checking the news or pulling out their phone in the subway, they're able to walk around in the world and have digital information seamlessly integrated with their environment. And I think for us as creators, the question is, what might that look like? And more importantly, what's the business model that supports that? Because when I see a signal like this, when I see a project like this at a tech company, it makes me ask a question that I don't hear enough news organizations asking. It's a question like, what does an always-on, contextually relevant subscription product look like? Is it paid by a subscription? Is it paid by the device makers? Is it something else? If we can't reckon with what we might put onto a device like this, we risk being displaced by other types of organizations. And so we need to be thinking about this in order to meet consumer expectations, to compete with this kind of emerging media. If we don't plan for this future, our current products may not be enough. We should be asking questions like, how will these devices change news gathering? How will they change how we report? Will they create new types of user-generated content that displace the kinds of video that we've previously created? Will they make it possible to sort of have everyone on the record at all times because there will be this propagation of recording devices? This is a really especially important question because as journalists, we really need to think about how this will affect our news gathering and what surfaces, what questions we should be asking as reporters, because we're not just responsible to use these technologies to propagate our businesses, but it's also essential that we use our knowledge as journalists to challenge these technologies and to think about what the implication they have on society is. So if we're making assumptions in our operating models about how information is available and where it comes from, we risk being caught off guard if that's not true in the future. So it's really not enough to just observe that this is happening. I believe that it's possible to use this kind of analysis to make better choices today. But it starts with seeing trends, and then comes the hard part, then comes acting. And so we need to be using these insights to investigate new partnerships, to identify areas for talent development and new hires. And most importantly, for finding the kinds of opportunities that will let us grow as organizations. And so I sort of want to put this question to you, which is, does your strategic planning assume the future will look like today? Because if we're not building our future, if we're not actively cultivating and creating what the future should look like, we'll find ourselves in a world that's built by someone else. And I think being essential just doesn't guarantee our future. Yes, we know that news is important. Yes, we know that our products deliver lots of value to the communities that they operate in. But news is just one of the many services that consumers subscribe to. And being essential to democracy is great, but that's not enough to provide, that's not enough to justify people's use of our product. We need to really provide people a product that they will value, because at the end of the day, our industry is too important to assume that everything will just be rosy. Unless we build a future for our organizations, there's no guarantee that this is going to continue. So I really hope that you can incorporate this into your strategic planning. And if you take one thing away from this talk, I hope that that you can go back to your teams and that you can take a hard look at the kinds of assumptions that you're making in your strategic planning processes, and really think through what kinds of questions and actions you can take. And I hope in the Q&A portion, we could spend a little bit of time talking about what some of those actions might be. And so that's where I'm at, and I'll hand it back to Paul to kind of take us through. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that thoughts. And I didn't even think about give synthetic media and deepfake that much credit. But you're really, really right. It's slowly creeping in, and we should expect bigger application for it in the new year and beyond. So, Nick, you wrote an entire report on what we should expect in 2022 for the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. So let's go into that presentation, and we are going to have an extensive discussion on the issues and topics being raised.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Sam. So just a bit of background on me. So my background's a journalist, but I also spent 10 years running product and technology teams. So I've got sort of that sort of perspective on things. If you don't know the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, although it has the name Reuters, we're actually based at the University of Oxford. So we're an academic institution, and we have a fellowship program which takes mid-career journalists from around the world, and then we also have a research side, and I lead a lot of the research. I do a big audience report every year called the Digital News Report, which comes out in June, and then I do this report at the beginning of every year, which I've actually done for 15 years, which looks at trends and predictions. So it's a bit more sort of future facing, but it's definitely rooted in the research we do at the Institute. It's rooted in the interviews and discussions we have with industry leaders, and specifically in a survey we do every year, at the beginning of every year, about what the industry is expecting, where they're putting their money. This year we had 52 countries represented. It's the widest ever, 246 senior participants. So these are real decision makers. You see there more than 50 editors-in-chief, CEOs, publishers, heads of digital innovation, these kind of people, and a mix of sort of broadcast, commercial, and digital-born brands. I'll talk, I guess, for 20 minutes or so. These slides, by the way, are available afterwards if anyone's interested, and the full report is free and open from our website. So I think actually one of the most surprising findings for me this year, particularly because the sort of prevailing narrative is that, you know, this is an industry in crisis, is actually that 60% of publishers say that overall revenues have actually gone up over the last 12 months. Only 8% have gone down. So obviously there's many companies, many individual journalists who are really struggling at the moment, especially local news or in different parts of the industry. But quality newspapers certainly have been selling a lot of online subscriptions in the wake of COVID. We've also seen a really big bounce back in digital advertising over the last year, which has helped a lot too. But at the same time, we've also seen online traffic. It's falling in many cases, a much more mixed picture. A third saying page views have fallen, almost a quarter saying they've stayed the same. And if you look at industry data, so that's our survey, this is ComScore data from the US and UK, you can really see quite acute falls in both countries in online traffic. So this sort of illustrates the so-called Trump slump in the US after the dramas of January 2021. You can see how far and how fast that fall. Sites like the Washington Post down 28%, for example, year on year. But also, similar decline for many publishers in the UK. Now, obviously, some of this is just cyclical after this very extraordinary period for news. But I think this graph also represents something else, a sort of much deeper and more fundamental challenge for publishers as consumption moves online. We're seeing essentially a sort of loss of interest in news and politics from certain groups. You'll know people complain a lot about the depressing nature of the news, the lack of trust in politics and in journalism. And I think some of this is sort of illustrative of that. I think it's going to be a real theme of 2022, this sort of disconnection, if you like. Specifically on the business side, and Sam's talked about business transformation and disruption. One of the questions we ask is, what is your most important revenue source going to be in 2022? And if you ask industry leaders this, it's really interesting to see subscription and membership there at the top. Now, we've seen this sort of shift towards paid content in different forms, and this is kind of illustrative of that. A few years ago, it was advertising, obviously, at the top, and subscriptions become much more important. I think the other change is this is really becoming a worldwide trend. So a few years ago, it was just confined to a few richer countries, but in our survey, we have Paul, we have Nigeria, we have Indonesia, Vietnam, countries in Latin America represented. Many of those have really just started on their subscription or membership journey in the last year or so. Donations, so a number of individuals and companies now supported by donations. That's become more important over time. We're also seeing publishers looking to other kinds of funding, including from platforms. But overall, I think we shouldn't look at this as sort of subscriptions taking over from advertising. This is not a binary debate. This is much more about combination of income streams. Most of the publishers we're talking to are looking to be supported by 3 or 4 income streams because they're really looking for resilience. They're looking for multiple streams. So if advertising suddenly goes wrong, then the industry doesn't go down the chute. Of course, there's a huge discussion at the moment about whether having more subscriptions or more paid content online will increase information inequality. So, will richer users effectively have access to better quality, better sources of information than poorer users? And in our survey, many respondents are really, getting quite worried about whether they're just sort of super serving richer, more educated audiences. And actually, many this year are looking at launching lower price subscription products. I think that's a trend that we're going to see. We're also seeing more bundling. We're also seeing more subscriptions given away to students and others not prepared to pay, though that will just be a sort of drop in the ocean, really. I think on the business side this year, what can we expect? I think a lot of M&A activity. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got sort of digital-born publishers like BuzzFeed, who are squeezed, of course, now between the sort of new entrants on the one hand, and then Google and Facebook in terms of advertising revenue. So they really need scale right now, and they've gone public. BuzzFeed's gone public. Others are talking about going public. So they've got a bit of money to spend to get bigger. Then you've also got some traditional companies looking for scale as well, but in different ways. So New York Times, for example, at the beginning of the year did a tie-up with The Athletic. So they're kind of looking to find different audiences and maybe potentially bundle athletic content with their existing subscriber base or with other products and brand extensions that they've built over the last few years. So many publishers looking to add a bit more than news into a bundle that has more retention and more stickiness. I think we'll see more of that. And everyone's worried about subs fatigue. The subs growth is slowing down, and so they need to think about retention. They need to think about growth in different ways. Yeah, and I think we already seen certain software to bypass paywalls. If you remember a few years ago, it was all about ad blocking software. I think we're going to see more paywall blocking software over the next few years. So we saw this trend towards journalists actually being able to start up companies and make significant amounts of money. So the so-called Substack phenomenon, taking advantage of subscription platforms, lower cost, to earn very large amounts of money from largely email-led businesses. Now, we've already seen some of those sort of drift back to mainstream media, partly because, it's actually a lot of stress operating on your own and people want to be part of something bigger, or some people do. I think this year we're going to see something more in the middle. So we've already seen the sort of launch of sort of journalist collectives, if you like, sort of halfway houses where they're trying to get the best of both. They can still be entrepreneurial and make money, but they're part of, a group of journalists who are building connections, using that sort of community and the network, which is part of the, key part of the creative economy. So Puck is one example of this, just launched in the US, very interesting company. Tortoise Media in the UK is sort of reasonably similar, started a few years ago, very interesting company. I think we're also going to see more newsletter-led publications with lower cost models, partly based on subscription. So obviously we've talked a lot about the problems of local journalism. In the UK, we have, really successful, very small scale publications setting up in cities in the north, such as the Manchester Mill, and then based on newsletters, so sort of slow journalism, but journalism that's really useful to people. Axios Local is the same basic idea, has this massive ambition to bring their sort of idea of smart brevity and newsletter-led news to every community in America, and building it up slowly, so as it becomes more successful, they can invest more. Again, multiple business models. It won't just be subscription, but I think that's going to be really interesting and really worth watching. Big play. When we look at investment generally in innovation in specific features or channels, this is a question we asked about, where are you putting your effort this year? And you can see that 80% of the publishers we talked to said they were going to put more money in podcasts, or they were going to put more money in email newsletters, which we've already mentioned. And to some extent, more investment in digital video too. Whereas some of the technologies that Sam was talking about, the Metaverse or AR, are largely at the moment on the back burner. Not to say they won't become more important going forwards, but right now, I think this speaks to the industry really trying to focus on features that are going to deliver today, that are going to deliver on engagement and acquisition or retention, which are the core issues. If we look at audio specifically, last year we predicted sort of this real explosion in audio formats, and I think we saw that, not just podcasts, but we saw the rise and fall of Clubhouse, of course, sort of so-called social audio. We saw this year, we've also seen this raft of investments by platforms, which is really interesting in audio. So Facebook in particular, I think it's hilarious that Mark Zuckerberg talks about this new medium of audio when, as Sam was showing, radio has actually been around quite a long time, and the power of audio has been very well known as an intimate medium. And voice prompts or voice notes, I think, again, really catching fire now. So I think voice is something that's really here to stay. I think the challenge is, of course, where to invest, how to stand out in audio. Something like Spotify has 3 million podcasts now in the directory, podcast shows, so it gets even harder to create something that has value. So the business model gets much harder. This year, we're going to see the fruits of the New York Times investment in its audio app. So leveraging some of the acquisitions like serial productions, they're incorporating read articles from different publishers. So that's really interesting, getting into the aggregation business. I really like this product as a product manager myself. I really like this product approach, which is based on thinking about audiences, thinking about moments when people might be open to audio. And this is from their product team, sort of illustrates that they're just hitting the blue at the moment with the daily, and there are many more opportunities where people might want to receive information through their ears, as Sam was talking about, going forwards. So what might happen this year in audio? I think partly because of this abundance problem, we're going to see audio shortening. So audio is a very self-indulgent, could do with some edits sometimes. Some of the podcasts take an hour and a half or more, and even daily news podcasts are 25 minutes. And I think we're going to see this new sort of short form audio, maybe 5 minutes. Again, it's this idea of smart brevity, but in audio. This is a BBC publication that's just been launched, podcast, 5 minutes on a topical subject and everything you need to know, sort of how to explain it type stuff. We're also going to see this sort of destination battle between platforms and publishers hot up. Who gets the value from the best content, who controls the experience. I've already mentioned the New York Times trying to start off as a destination, and I think we'll move into aggregation, but others like the BBC are looking at that as well, and definitely not wanting to release all of their all of the money they put into specific podcasts into platforms like Spotify and Apple and let them take the value. So I think windowing is definitely one way in which they'll get around that. So their loyal users get something first, and obviously paid podcasts is a thing as well as part of that. I think investment in audio, of course, is part of the battle to reach younger audiences, which I think will be and is another huge theme for many publishers. So talking to subscription publishers, only something like 5% or less of those who are paying are under 30. So 95% are over 30. Public broadcasters also really struggling to get to this group. And they tend to prefer the convenience of social platforms, for example. So it's not surprising that in our survey, publishers say they are planning to put a lot more effort this year into Instagram, net score plus 54%, TikTok plus 44%, YouTube, and they're planning to put less effort into Twitter and less effort into Facebook. And I think this is partly because everyone's been galvanized by TikTok, by the sort of creativity of the new sort of video formats which they've pioneered, which are entertaining but increasingly have information as part of them as well. And you'll see you are seeing the other platforms really investing in this. So Instagram Reels, Facebook Reels now as well, YouTube Shorts, and I think these formats, these short video formats, are going to be a real feature of this year. Some people are even talking about a second pivot to video. You may remember the first one didn't work out so well for publishers, but I think that might happen. This is Sophia Smith-Gaylor, who's formerly of the BBC, now with Vice, arguing that traditional media is still far too focused on Twitter. Journalists are on it, their bosses are on it, lovely feedback loop, but actually that's not where the audiences are. If you look at the data, I mean, they are on Twitter, but they're also increasingly on these visual formats. And this is going to be really important to take these seriously this year. The other point I think which she makes here is that visual platforms are different and they require a different set of skills. So, definitely publishers or journalists need to tool up in that area, I think. One slightly optimistic prediction is if we are to see a second pivot to video, it might include a few more facts, a little bit less opinion. So we're sort of seeing very successful brands in TikTok, like Actuality, a Spanish startup, has more followers than the Washington Post and BBC combined. They really understand the platform and it's fact-filled. You have Ros Atkins from the BBC, who does this daily monologue of about 7 to 10 minutes, engaging, but also impartial or objective. And it's hugely successful. I mean, the ones on Boris Johnson's current problems in the UK had about 11 million just for the first few, which is, way more than anything he was getting on television, for example. And then the one on the right, the News Movement, which is another sort of startup, high-profile startup, headed by some very senior executives. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch. Again, primarily native video and visual formats, younger presenters trying to take a different approach and use this sort of new wave of video. It won't, of course, be all fact and evidence based. We can expect the same distribution channels to be used by those who want to express strong opinions or even disinformation. And you may have seen, I predicted that there'll be a lot more heat around Spotify, a lot more heat around YouTube this year. We've already seen it. I think Neil Young had a big protest about Joe Rogan and misinformation, and Neil Young's music is the stuff that's been taken off, but that story won't end this year. Another big theme this year is the enormous change in how newsrooms operate. I think both because of hybrid working, but also the many leadership changes in the BBC in newsrooms. So Washington Post, BBC have new leaders, for example. Many of the new leaders are women. Many of them are women of color. And I think many of the new faces are also questioning traditional approaches. If we take hybrid working, this is from a survey we did a couple of months ago, actually, which showed that people actually feel around journalism that hybrid working has helped efficiency. So it's been good for efficiency. It's been good for employee well-being because of the greater flexibility, even though not for all. But people feel there's been real losses when it comes to creativity, collaboration, and communication. And I think this year, hopefully, we'll sort of move out of this enforced remote working towards a state where hybrid working, genuine hybrid working becomes more the norm. And I think the challenge there is how do you build back creativity, collaboration, and communication? And that's going to require discipline in terms of the process, in terms of when different teams come in and physically see each other. It's going to require new tools. And I think beyond that, it's going to need rethinking what the newsroom is for. So I think in many publishers, it's going to be less about the place where journalists do their work, and that's going to be done elsewhere in many cases. It'll be more about how do we collaborate, how do we build these spaces where maybe we can interact with our audiences or our members. This is an example from El Diario in Spain, which is a membership organization, and during the pandemic they redesigned their offices for member events, for more video, for more collaboration. And you have publishers like, local publishers like Reach in the UK and Archant closing the majority of their offices and putting their staff on different contracts. And again, using the remaining offices in different ways for training, for collaboration, for different kinds of processes. So that's going to really be a very interesting story this year. Paul mentioned climate change. I know you've had a webinar on that. And I think we're going to see, real focus from journalists and others on how to do this better. In our survey, we found that although people think their own coverage is good always, only a third think that the news industry's coverage of climate change is good. And I, having read all the comments from those who submitted the survey, I think that reflects a frustration that people feel that the coverage they're putting in, the effort they're putting in, isn't really resonating with people. It's not resonating with audiences. It often doesn't get read, for example, as much as we would hope. And that comes out of sort of 5 things here, really. Firstly, the nature of the story is often very slow moving, and we have this very fast moving news cycle. Secondly, the sort of doomsday narrative that many media companies take to climate change puts a lot of people off and leads people to feel powerless. And that means that there's not the business case to really invest in journalists who have the knowledge and can make that subject much more accessible. And then you've also got, some legacy problems of pressure exerted by owners and advertisers as well. I think one of the really interesting thing on the question of skills, some respondents to our survey feel that newsrooms really have a fundamental problem around science stories, which we also saw during COVID, which needs to be addressed this year and are trying to do so. We have innovation. Obviously, many publishers are really trying to do something about this. So there's an example from Die Zeit, has a program of constructive solutions-based journalism and has created a whole sort of series of journalistic examples of that. And then I think technology may be able to help. I really love the Rainforest Investigations Network and what it's been doing. It's doing a fantastic job of, documenting effectively, using data, real live data, what's happening to the rainforests around the world, and then using that to investigate stories, to visualize trends. And I think these kind of skills of cartography and data are going to be critical for tracking not just this story, but many other stories going forwards. So finally, what can we expect in terms of next generation technologies? I'm not going to do much on this because Sam's talked about this a lot already. There's a lot going on and a lot of new terms being thrown around. Maybe not all of it feels relevant to journalism today, but as Sam says, we need to start thinking about it. I'm not going to talk about the metaverse or Web3, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence, how it's being used today, which hopefully dovetails what Sam talked about already. So in our survey, when we ask people about, which newsroom uses of AI will be most important, our survey respondents identified 5 things essentially. So the most important currently, and where the investments are going, is in basically making recommendations, using artificial intelligence to recommend the next best thing you might read, for example, so that you can increase engagement, so you can increase relevance, which is a key challenge for all publishers. Secondly, commercially, so publishers are using it to identify, for example, potential subscribers, and to show them different things potentially, and maybe using artificial intelligence for that. Thirdly, newsroom automation, that's a big subject. So that's, tools for automatic transcription, which are now being productized much more in newsrooms. But also, I think Sam mentioned, automatic translation to enable, or semi-translation to enable brands to more easily and more efficiently take their content to different territories. So that's a current use, which is picking up traction. And automated summarization as well. And then there's news gathering and robo-journalism. Sam has mentioned synthetic media, these ever more powerful models that allow narrative stories to be written off data, and not just narrative stories, visuals and video as well, as we saw. My take on this is, I think for journalism, one of the things that's often not talked about in terms of AI, but its importance is not necessarily the front page, personalizing the front page of a news organization, of a website, but it's more about format innovation. And it's about, increasingly the problem is that people want to get their news in different ways, and we produce it in articles or in videos. And actually, how can you speed up that process, enable formats to be created more easily for different audiences? So I think what we're going to see is increased bullet points of news and articles. So for example, the BBC is taking a summarization prototype it's been running this year and adding it to its story. So the top of every story will have AI-driven summarization, and maybe over time, younger people or people who really want that kind of format can see more of that and get rather than seeing the longer story first. So it might be about just the way in which we present our news might be different. Visual stories, again, they've been working on a prototype that automatically creates sort of visual-based stories from text-based stories and allows a bit of automation in there. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and obviously audio as well. So many publishers like the Washington Post are already using synthetic voices, synthetic media, to take the text story, turn it into audio and turn it into different languages. So I think, AI is not something for tomorrow. AI is something for today. 5 takeaways. So firstly, I think that point about younger audiences is almost the number one priority for publishers right now. I kind of explained why, and I think that requires different formats, different channels, different tone, potentially different content as well. Product-wise, focusing really on loyalty, connection, and that's why I talked about podcasts so much, and audio, and that's why I talked about newsletters. These are not exactly forward-thinking formats. They've been around for a long time, but they're being reinvented. More paid content, and we've got that concern about, what does that mean for journalism as a public good that's available to everybody, free at the point of use. New challenges ahead over how to make hybrid newsrooms work. I mean, not just in journalism, but I think that's a massive issue for many journalists around the world. And how do you get your community in this new world? And then what about these new skills? Some of the stories that we face, like, how do you cover tech companies? How do you cover climate change? Require different skills around data visualization and investigations, and it will be different to how it was in the past. So yeah, that's our report this year. Again, you can get all the details for free on our website. And back to Paul.
Yes, so thank you very much for the presentations, and yes, there are lots of questions, lots of questions that I'm not lying. Look at my notes. Okay, sorry. I have lots of them. So I'd like to start with this. With these numerous innovations and different approaches to journalism, how far do you think we are going to go away from journalism the philosophy and the rules that guide journalism. And do you think journalists will still be relevant, considering that these tools are at anybody's disposal? And many of the developments that we've had in terms of news getting to much more people than before, most of them didn't originate from news outlets. So how do you see 2022 playing out in journalism still being relevant and the rules of journalism still being adhered to? Let me start with Nick, then we'll go to Sam.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, why do we need journalism when we have Twitter, but actually the research we've done shows that in Twitter and Facebook, for example, most people are looking at mainstream media organizations. Journalism still matters, and I think COVID shows that journalism still matters, but I am worried about disconnection. I'm also worried about the blurring of the lines between journalism and information that is just published on the internet, which obviously is now possible, that wasn't possible before. And I think that's a real challenge, and that's contributed to the decline in trust. And I think what we need to do is sort of separate out a bit more journalism, which remains relevant, and the skills of journalism of presenting, analyzing, explaining why things matters in an objective way remains incredibly important. And we need to find ways to sort of almost double down on that going forwards, because obviously if we don't, we see some of the problems that emerge as a result.
Sam.
Yeah, I think that I think Nick framed that very, very well. And I think what I would add to it is to say, I think as we look to the future and we think about sort of how does journalism remain relevant in the future, part of the question is, and the reason that these conversations are so important, is how do we ensure that that we are applying the values of journalism in a forward-looking way? And so how do we make sure that we're really engaging with the question of what does it mean to use something like synthetic media in a journalistic way? What are the journalistically ethical ways to do that? What are not? Because I think that there's a tremendous imperative that we have as journalists to be able to help our audiences understand these technologies, and to help them understand why, if we're using this technology to develop new types of storytelling or new story forms that are additive and more engaging, why that's a good thing, and why something that they might encounter elsewhere is not. That what is different about the synthetic media that we're using in our organizations and the synthetic media that's being used to distract or disinform or to create less valuable experiences. And so I think part of the question there is, in order to remain relevant, those values, which Nick, I think, did a really great job of explaining how important and essential they are, I think we need to be doing a lot of work sort of proactively to try to teach our audiences what it is that we're doing and what that value is, and how we're applying it in the future.
Yeah, still with you, Sam. You really drew attention to, and of course, I think Nick also mentioned is artificial intelligence and deepfake, synthetic media. Will, what do you see about regulating these tools? Do you think those that could actually ensure that these tools are not abused are at the forefront of this innovation? Or what do you see as the best approach to ensure that these tools do not get into the wrong hands, especially considering polarization in the media itself already? Sam?
Yeah, so I think that there is definitely signs that platforms are creating sort of, this isn't regulation, but these are sort of rules for what is acceptable to post on their platform. So I think both Facebook and Twitter and YouTube all have sort of rules around what kinds of manipulation are acceptable in a video and what kinds are not. But that's a little bit different from sort of wholesale regulation. I think this is a technology that's mainstream enough that it's really, that consumers are encountering it sort of in very incremental ways, and so it's in some ways very mainstream. But I think it's not so mainstream that I think we have a great frame for how we might regulate it. And I think the other question is really to say, any kind of regulation is, like any regulation of speech, is potentially a very nervous challenge. That it might be something that we don't want to, that the lines we draw could be very could be abused or that. That's to come back to the point that I was making before. I think that's why it's so important as journalists that we have a clear understanding of how we want to be using these technologies, so that we can have a say in what are acceptable uses and what are not.
Okay, so we have a question for Nic, and I'm going to read it now. What data do we have on adoption and success of revenue methods such as subscriptions in poorer countries?
We have quite poor data, really. I mean, I think there's two sources of data. One is survey data, which has a few flaws when it comes to asking about things that aren't very popular in certain countries. So you tend to get people including other things in it that aren't about news subscriptions. But in general, we find that the levels are obviously much lower in many of the countries that you're talking about, and that's partly because there's fewer publishers trying to charge for content. It's also because there's less disposable income around to pay for online news, which is seen as potentially less valuable to people in many cases than things like entertainment subscriptions. However, I do think that we are seeing a move to subscriptions generally, and news is part of that, media is part of that. And so if you can provide value, as I mentioned earlier, in almost every country we looked at, we are seeing, either the quality publishers or niche publishers starting to use subscription or membership models or donation models. So I think over the next few years, that's going to build, even if the prices are a little bit lower.
Okay, so we have another question. I think maybe the two of you can answer this question. Okay, so the question is from Christina. And Christina would like to know, do you think that AI-created editorial content should be marked to be distinguished from human content? Let's start with Nic, then Sam will also come in.
I think it's very hard to define what is AI-created content, because I think a lot of the stuff we're going to be looking at is a mix. So it might have had an AI element to it, like some of the automatic translation that I'm talking about. The first stage of it is automatically translated, and then there's a bit of overlay. So I think that's quite tricky. I mean, a lot of the early examples of robo-journalism have absolutely had clear labeling around it. So The Guardian, for example, that did some robo-journalism and some early experiments, made very clear and made a feature of the fact this was robo-journalism indeed. But I think going forwards, that's going to be harder. I think a lot of people, really what they pay attention to is the brand that it's coming from. And it's about, I think, telling a story around the checks and about what your journalism is about, whether it's, whether AI is supporting that or not, as Sam was saying. But in general, I'm pretty worried about the next phase. We don't even understand the current phase. We don't even understand, that we're already in a mess. You layer on AI technologies and the ability to deceive people even further in even more powerful ways. I'm pretty worried about it. And I think, that's why, I mean, Sam's right to raise all the free speech concerns, and regulation is happening whether we like it or not, and it is moving into some of that free speech area, and many people think it's a good thing, even though you need to be really careful when you're treading in this area.
Sam?
Yeah, and apologies for putting a mask on. I have some work happening in the apartment, and so I am going to wear a mask a little bit. But I think that I agree with everything that Nic just said. I think that the question of what is sort of algorithmic or synthetic media is going to get sort of blurrier and blurrier, because the example of, I think anyone can sort of, who's used Gmail or Google Docs, has seen the experience of starting to type and having Google autocomplete the word that you're thinking about. And so if that's algorithmically powered. And so the question is, where do we want to draw the line? Where do we want to sort of create that distinction? And yeah, that's where I'll start. I've lost my train of thought for a second, but I think that's exactly how I'd say that.
Okay, okay. There's another question for Nick. Okay, just wanted to, I think from Sambit. Hi, Nick. Just wanted to understand from you, will misinformation be mainstreamed, and will it not be a major factor in journalism in the coming years, or will it come in a newer avatar?
It's a difficult question. Misinformation is such a difficult term to define, and if you look at it from an audience point of view, there's sort of stuff that's completely made up. Obviously, we had an epidemic of that was moving through platforms, but actually, there's many other kinds of things that audiences define as misinformation, including content that they read from mainstream media, and what they're really talking about is stuff that they think is politically biased, where that mainstream media organization is essentially spinning something or spinning some politics in ways that they don't agree with. So I think that that's what a lot of people are talking about when it comes to misinformation. That's one of the reasons why we see trust in media organizations going down. So in that sense, misinformation or bias is absolutely mainstream and is rife in many of our environments and in a polarized society. That's why the term misinformation is so confusing and difficult, because audiences think it's something completely different from journalists.
Yeah, I understand. Now, there is something around this trend of things getting shorter. Almost every platform has shorts, YouTube shorts, Instagram, all these. Even news outlets are also leveraging these tools. To what extent do you think journalism can go with the trend in shortening things? And at what point do you think media houses will be like, no, we've done enough. We can no longer shorten our news. And
How short can you go? Right, exactly.
how short can we go?
You
And
know,
is shortening these things actually good for journalism?
well, I think the key thing to remember is it's not a replacement. So even when you talk to young people in focus groups, there are many different kinds of young people, and they don't all want stuff in little 1-minute bites. But it's much more about the circumstances, about when they're open to news. And so, we've defined different frameworks for this. So, when they want a bit of distraction, so they've got 5 minutes, then this kind of format works really well. But other times they're also sort of saving a long read for the weekend or listening to a podcast that might last an hour and a half, as I mentioned earlier. So, it's not true that young people only want sort of snacks. I think this idea of smart brevity, though, is incredibly powerful, however you apply it, whatever format. And because I think young and old people essentially are overloaded with mediums. So media that doesn't waste their time with 800-word articles, when you can just sort of, you can get to the core of what they need to know more quickly, that feels really important. I think that's what Sam's talking about before in terms of forward thinking. Don't be rooted in the format and think that's journalism. Journalism is your ability to explain or contextualize and tell stories. And you can do that in many, many different ways.
And sort of solving for that is a place that the technology potentially can be really impactful, that being able to structure the data and structure the facts in such a way that we can be supported by technology to either package that as a really long read that you can consume on the weekend, or as a bite-sized sort of piece of smart brevity that you can get on your walk to the subway, and everything in between based on what you need at the moment. I think that's something that no newsroom is going to be able to produce all those formats seamlessly at one time, but sort of structured with the help of technology, you can imagine a world where that gap is bridged a little bit.
Okay, yeah, there is also this interesting question on subscription that I was an anonymous attendee, by the way. With the subscription model building and the public media industry needing to identify new revenue opportunities as current audience age or decline, but the conundrum of the public media mission of free news and entertainment for all. Do you have any advice or suggestions from public media in particular in this era? Nick?
Okay, so I think public media, that sort of mission of creating something for everybody, is at the heart of a lot of public media. certainly in Northern Europe. I mean, less so in the US and Brazil and a few other countries. But I think, I think you can argue it two ways. So many people argue that on the internet, there are so many different perspectives. You don't really need a public media to do that for you. You can create your own plurality, if you like. And I simply don't think that's true for the majority of people, because most people still only use one or two sources. And so I think I think that mission could be reinvented and probably needs to be reinvented. And I guess it goes, I just don't think you can leave it all to the market. And I think some of the strongest media systems are ones where you have a great balance of public media and commercial media, providing different value to different audiences. But I think that sort of baseline, I mean, for example, it'd be interesting Sam's view on this, but in the UK, we have something like 70% of people using the BBC News every week. So a core of facts that basically you can start a conversation because people have broadly got the same set of facts. And that's probably not true in the US. Because the fragmentation and the different perspectives and spins is so acute in the US, and you don't have that sort of single brand that kind of holds at least the fact level together. So I personally still think it's incredibly important. If anything, what we're seeing now in terms of misinformation, the role of public media is more important, and it's fascinating to see some people in the US calling for more public media, more spending on public media in the US. I don't think it'll happen, but I think it's interesting to see that debate.
Sam, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is deeply personal for me, because one of the hats that I wear as the product lead for WNYC, which is the public radio station in New York City, and one of the biggest stations in the United States. And so I think there is, for all the reasons that Nic outlined, I think that there really is an urgency and an importance to remaining committed to that vision and that mission of public media. And I think that the question becomes, to what extent are all the tactics that are being used in other forms of media to sell subscriptions and to boost engagement relevant in public media? I think that it's sort of it's clearly counter to the mission of public media to sort of put up a paywall. But to what extent can we use that kind of thinking about engagement, thinking about how and when to message our users and to message the public about how to support us? How can we use that to be smarter and more sophisticated about when we make those pitches? And so I think that the question is for public media, how to have these conversations about the future grounded in that mission, and to recognize that just because the world is changing doesn't mean that public media needs to look the same as it always has, assuming that there's always going to be a pledge drive or government funding to support things is, I think, a dangerous place to be. But the question is, how can we solve that mission or solve for that mission as we think about that uncertainty? And I tend to agree with Nic that at least in the United States, there is not more funding coming for public media, but even in other parts of the world, including in the UK, there's some sort of dangerous signs about sort of what public funding for media might look like. And so I think being able to incorporate that into the strategic planning and to think about what other opportunities to fund ourselves as public media might we have is a really essential and urgent question.
Yeah, the second to last question that we can take, because we've really short the time, is from Jumana. Would like to know, what about the audience, younger and older generations? Will it be enough to get audio or short reports on news? Could you please share some of your thoughts? Thanks. Nic, I'd like your thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, we're doing a lot more research into that this year, partly prompted by sort of publisher concern about it. So looking again at what kind of combination of things might work. And I don't think there's a single solution to that. I mean, I think it's really understanding that there isn't such a thing as a young audience in the first place. There are lots of different young audiences, and they probably want things different, and stuff is fragmenting. So part of the answer is what I was talking about, what Sam's been talking about in terms of how do you more easily create and version some of your core journalism in different ways for younger audiences. That may be doing things in your own website, which just assumes less knowledge, just makes it more accessible. I think that will benefit everybody. But you may also need to create formats specifically for young people, or to take them to specific platforms where there's either a business model or where there's distribution and marketing. So and then but I think a lot of it is definitely rethinking some of those assumptions and saying, we've got stuff that's relevant, but how do we make it more relevant? Is that format? Is it tone? Is it who's telling the story? And it will be a mix of all of those different things. And I think that applies to commercial media, it applies to public media. Everyone needs to really embrace this, the very, very significant change, particularly from under 25s. So the big change we see in our data is that sort of digital natives who really have very, very different approaches and are not going to fall into reading a newspaper or watching television news or listening to public radio in the same way.
Okay. Yeah, so what is driving, my last question, what is driving this obsession with the young, the youth, especially with the media?
What's driving it? Well, what's driving it
is it financially sustainable and reliable for journalism?
What's driving it is the data, so that young people are not using television news to the same extent because of that change that I talked about. So if you're a television broadcaster or radio broadcaster, you're seeing that fall off in audience, and that's growing. The speed of that is growing. If you're a subscription publisher, you notice that you don't have any young subscribers. So you think, okay, well, we can last for a few years, but when everyone dies, we're basically sunk. So we need a different business model. So it's not sort of existential today for the subscription publishers. It's much more about how do we create habit today so that we can bring them in at a later stage. So yeah, I mean, it's basically they're looking at the data and they're getting worried.
And I will add that I think it's not just the data about consumption of media or consumption of news. It's also the data about how are all people, but young people in particularly, interacting with technology and interacting with devices and discovering information. So thinking about the ways that I think about my son, and I realize I don't know that my son is ever going to learn to type, because for him it's going to be so natural to talk to Siri on a phone to ask for something, and that's a very different form of interaction with technology than sitting down and listening to a podcast or listening to or reading an article. And so I think it's sort of looking at that trend of broadly how are people interacting with technology, not just I think the very compelling data that Nic just brought about. What we see today is that young people aren't consuming media in the same way as older generations.
I agree with you. Before, if you want to read the news, maybe you open the BBC, you go to the website, or you go to you log onto the TV, you switch on your TV, or you read the newspapers. But today, you can do something as simple as just say, Alexa, what is the most popular news today? And you get your news without even having to get it. Why will I say Alexa? And I'm like,
we knew this was going to happen. We knew this was going to happen.
Why will I say Alexa?
Who have you got in your flat? We need to know.
So that is what is happening right now, without even opening up turning up anything. This happens, and I think it's going to be revolutionary and redirect how journalism is going to be in the nearest future. I really want to appreciate our resource persons for being meticulous and taking our time to actually join us today. And if you want they've agreed to share their presentations with us. So I've put a message in the chat that if you want to be able to access it, please be part of our forum. Go to there is a link that I've already put there, and I know it's going to take you right into the forum page on Facebook, where I will be sharing their presentations. But this is an ongoing conversation, and we hope that you've been able to pick one of the two things to actually guide you in what you do and how you will better position yourself as a journalist or media entrepreneur or leader of an editorial team. To access more information on the ICFJ Global Health Crisis, sorry, I knew this would happen. on the forum, please go to ICFJ or the International Center for Journalists. Please go to www.icfj.org, and for more resources for journalists, please check out the IGNet platform on www.ignet.org. We'll be back next week for another exciting edition, and I want to say thank you very much But before I let our panelists go, please, what are your last remarks that I think should be the take-home for today? I'll start with Nick, then I'll go to Sam. I will call it a day from that point. Nick, what is your last word for us?
Oh dear, that's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think we've sort of talked about it really. I mean, forward thinking.
The mic is up.
Journalism still matters, but it needs to be expressed differently, and you need to think about audiences in different ways and how they're changing.
Yeah, and
okay.
I think I would.
Sam.
Yeah, I think that that taking that message of being forward thinking
I think my device is hanging up.
Exactly right. And I think that the one piece that I'd add is, as we think about what action looks like with these emerging technologies, as we think about how to prioritize and make space for other kinds of initiatives, remembering that action doesn't need to be spinning up a large team or investing lots of money. Action can be prioritizing
I can't hear myself
a
again,
small investigation. It can be prioritizing some kind of research. And so just remembering that action can take lots of different forms, and not trying to get scared or taken aback by the scope of the question, because moving forward and continuing to act to build the future of journalism is the thing that matters for us all.
We've lost our moderator.
Thank you
very much. Thanks a lot.
This has been very fun, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.